Hello again, everyone. So today I'm going to give what I understand about depression. What is depression? How does it come about? And what we can do about it to help ourselves and others. So that's the question today. What is depression? Well, in my understanding, depression is a change in conscious experience that has a cause, and it is not merely biochemical. In the old understanding in psychiatry, we say that serotonin, the neurotransporter or transmitter, is implicated in depression, and this has some evidence in that the SSRI drugs and similar derivatives, the monoamine type oxidase inhibitors, etc., which relate to methods of supply of serotonin reuptake and so on in the neural cranial cortex. This relates to the effect of depression. It's not the cause, in my view. That's the old monoamine biogenic theory. And it's not the cause, it's the effect, so that when someone is depressed, there may be these effects on serotonin. And similarly, we may posit that inflammation may be involved, and we may posit that there's an under-methylation in terms of their energy with the amino acids. That's a new area of exploration. Possibly methylation may be an effect of, it may be related to the cause, but it's an effect of relational events. What happens is we're relational beings, and our consciousness is affected by our relational experiences, the events in our environment that we experience, and we have capacity to respond pathologically or otherwise. Now, if someone experiences troublesome events and they don't have capacity or resilience for handling it, then they may develop depression in terms of their conscious experience. So how does this come about? Well, the first part of this whole chain of events whereby the serotonin may be affected, and the methylation and inflammation indeed in the gut can be affected by depressive conscience choices because of incapacity, is that the person, the precipitating event will be something along the lines of resource attachment loss. So someone has an attachment to some kind of resource in their environment, and in relating with that, it may be a person or an object or objects or some kind of process or but something, there's a resource of some kind, and there's an attachment to that resource in terms of meeting connection needs, and there's a loss of that connection or attachment to that resource, and this results in a decreased behavioral approach towards the object that provided the resource attachment. So that it could be a person, it could be a thing, it could be a process, it could be all kinds of various supply in terms of resource, but there's a loss, and that's the precipitating event that happens way long ago, before depression becomes a neural assembly, a neural pathway that is honed and becomes a way of life as a depressive syndrome. So that's the first thing that happens. You get resource loss, and then you get concomitant behavioral approach decrease towards the resource that is lost. Then the emotional perception the functionality, the object functionality in the inter-emotional perception will be anger. So the person will feel angry that they perceive that this resource, whatever it is, person, thing, whatever, process, status, whatever, is lost, and they objectify that as anger. So they will experience anger, but this will be an unpleasant thing for them, and as a result, then in a subjective kind of internal thinking, cognitive formulation of intention, they're going to experience grief as a subjective, intra-conscious, cognitive, intentional formulation of what's going on. They're going to experience grief. And then the third point of that is because as a sort of reaction to that, their interbehavioral presentation subjectively, so this is what other people will see, is a kind of apathy. And the person may or may not notice that, depending on their availability of capacity for insight, etc. But other people certainly notice that there'll be an apathy. It could be a mood apathy, or it could be a behavioral apathy, or it could be both. And this is the third sort of stage of the process of depression. So there's a subjective interbehavioral presentation of apathy. And then that will eventually objectify into an internalized emotional motivational state of depression, whereby the person experiences a lack of feelings of motivating energies towards behavioral and emotional response, and they objectify that as I am depressed. And that is the process of depression, and it's defined or diagnosed. I'm not a fan of diagnosis in the sense that I don't believe that depression is a disease. I believe it is an incapacitated response to relational events in the environment. So what we have to do to help with that is to increase resilience in a salutogenic kind of approach rather than a pathogenic approach, which is a pathogenic one would give us the what has happened, which is the serotonin and the methylation and all of that. But instead, if we focus on what has happened in terms of making it better for long-term resilience promotion, for well-being resilience promotion, then this is a much more effective way of dealing with depression, in my view, because it helps us to be able to do something useful to help ourselves and others from experiencing the worst effects of depression long term. Whereas you could just try and deal with the effects in terms of the biochemistry and give them antidepressants, which don't really work very well anyway, despite what the pharmaceutical industries will promote in their advertising. They tell you that it's related to serotonin. It may be, but if it is, then that is the effect of depression rather than the cause of depression. It's a logical fallacy to think that the cause is serotonin. It may not even be methylation, that it may be also something to do with the effect of a response, an incapacitated consciential response to the relational events. So in terms of the psychopathology cycle, then it starts with these adverse relational behavioral events which are sensed in the environment, and then this creates a sense of traumatic stress, threat, awareness, reaction, and then this results in a kind of intra-ego reification control process. So what people try and do is they try and strengthen the sense of themselves, the ego, in a reification kind of way, as we say in transpersonal and Gestalt therapy. And then after that, there's a kind of rumination in interrelational intentionality, and then it becomes fixed as an intrafixative desire activation. So you get a kind of motivational loss or increase or whatever it is in terms of mood, and you get these cognitive effects as well. And then you get the psychopathological symptoms coming out as depression in this case, in the perception of both the person that experiences it and others. And then the whole process starts again, because you go to your doctor or your psychologist, and you would try and deal with the relational events that have caused these things, or at least the response. You can't deal with the actual event. The event has happened. You can't change the history. We don't have time machines. We can't change what has happened in terms of the relational events. It's not possible. But what you can do is change the ability to respond in ways which work better for you and for others, so that the relational behavioral changes can occur, so that you don't have to suffer depression. You can, in my theory anyway, you can reduce the effect of those relational events upon your conscious experience, so that you don't have to experience so much dreadful depression, in my formulation. Now, how do we do that? Well, so in summary then, the problem with depression is a cognitive proposition in propositional memory that behavioral activity attachments don't work, because of course the person has had resource lost in the past from these environmental events, and so therefore they think that no matter what they do, they're not going to be able to, they can't do it, it's not going to work, they can't achieve the bodily actions, the behavioral changes necessary. So what do? Well, what they could do is learn better ways of relating, so that they're more resilient to the resource losses which will inevitably come along in life because of the way that things are. Or they, and then there's a process with that, or they can come at it from a cognitive intentional approach, which is the cognitive behavioral therapy approach, which is to change the implied cognitive propositional willingness, so that your intentions are changed. Instead of intending to avoid behavioral attachments altogether, to avoid the problem of anger and grief and so on, you can change your intentions on the basis that you begin to have faith that there will be supply, and that if there isn't supply, that you will manage. As a Christian, I would say that that this is a faithful position, because it's a belief. It's a belief that that it is possible to get through these relational losses, these resource losses. It's not that you won't suffer, but that you can get through them, and so it's a hopefulness that arises. That's what we're trying to do when we help someone with depression. So we're trying to connect with their will identity, so that, because what happens in depression is they believe that they are not a person who can. This is a belief that occurs eventually in depression. They believe that they are a person who cannot. So it affects their will identity. They believe that they are a person who cannot willingly connect with the resources that would enable the non-depressive behavioral emotion. So we need to engender hope. So how do you engender hope with someone? Well, first of all, we have to recognize that it's a need. So the need is to connect. This is the basis of depression. You've got a resource loss, and there's a need to connect with the resource that is lost. So in terms of intention, in the cognitive behavioral approach, what one would say is that you can make alternative connections. And then in terms of a relational learning approach, then it's increasing the faith dignity, the secure faith dignity, so that the desire to intend works. So then the question becomes, what behavior follows from that? Well, there's a process that goes on about that. But so in cognitive behavior therapy, we deal with the intention, so that it you get your cognition right, your emotion right, and then your beliefs and behavior will follow. The other approach is to, well, it relates to it really. It's to get your security and dignity supplied so that you are motivated again to behave usefully with your cognitive will. So one of the things that's helpful in this is to be experience an active kind of bodily forgiveness in an awareness of God's creative sense. So to become aware that God's creative energies are available to us because often if we're depressed we cannot imagine what it is that we might do or not do to avoid this problem of incapacity in behavioral energy. So what we can do is we can access through prayer God's creative sense, so that we can say, well, look, God, I don't have the energy, and that would be admitting the fact of it, but you are the creator, and your sense of forgiving energy can supply me with what I need by faith, and that will activate the body. And now, so psychodynamically, so just to reiterate, the anger becomes repressively emotionally dissociated. So because you don't like the experience of, in depression, you don't like the experience of anger for the loss of the resource, so that you dissociate from that, and then you intra-subjectify the evil cognitive misconnection. So in other words, you've lost the resource, so you internally subjectify the evil, you push it down, you subjectify the evil thoughts about that misconnection. You don't have that resource, so the thoughts about the disconnect with that resource loss become pushed down and subjectified inside, so that you repress the emotional anger, you disassociate from the anger, so you no longer are consciously aware of the anger that has been repressed. So it's anger repression basically, and you become behaviorally ignorant in the process, so that you cannot see a way how to enact what would be useful behaviorally or emotionally. So it's a proposed cognition, so you're proposing to subjectify the evil of misconnection from the resource loss, and it's a functional memory issue, so you forget those things that are painful, and that's how depression works. That is how it works psychodynamically in my formulation. So you're subjectifying the guilt, you're angry at the loss, and you seek to murder that anger. That's what repression of anger is all about. You objectify the murder of hope into a behavioral lack. So you say, well, I can't, because you've murdered hope because it's too dangerous. You don't want the anger again, and the guilt, you murder that as well. So you murder the guilt and you murder the hope at the same time. You murder the guilt of the loss, and you murder the hope, and you objectify that. And then in terms of the other aspects to it, you can subjugate the life guilt, so the bit that you don't like about the loss of the resource, that life guilt can be subjugated as well, and so that's the repressive bit. You repress that, and this causes the cognitive implications and the memory association incongruence. And so what one can instead do is to connect with a freedom of hopeful life. And that's only something that can be achieved not by drugs, so you can't do it by serotonin reuptake inhibitors or NSRIs or any of these other things alone. They may temporarily help with the experience, but they don't solve the long-term resilience problem that we have in depression. So what we need to do is to connect to graceful meaning. That's God's province, so it's a spiritual thing. We have to connect to the graceful meaning in our cognitive approach. So the implicational coherence attachment becomes important. What really do we mean by the connections that we need? And this brings about the sense of hope, awareness, freedom, and actualization in our thinking, and then our memory can, in our internal memories about ourselves, can reassociate to that which is helpful, and then we can begin the process of amelioration in depression. So it's graceful attachment of presence which brings about this hope. So it's the grace to attach to hopeful presence in God, of course, because He is the source of all of these useful things. And it's intralinguistic coherence. So you'll be saying things that are, the words of Christ that bring life. And its intracognitive implications are hopeful in terms of grace experience and attachment of presence of God in our life. And so the activation purpose, ambition, of what is social, a lot of the needed social behaviors, and so our response is acceptance, obedience of Christ's creative grace for us in terms of supply of might to be able to change that. Now, the final thing that I want to say in terms of an assessment that can help someone make use of this theory is to say that our I'm just looking at my assessment here. So what we're looking for is cognitive propositional action memory. So this is what is repressed, the cognitive propositional action memory, and the behavioral activity connection attachment. So because there's a resource loss, there's a problem in behavioral activity connection attachment. This is why they're apathetic. And then there's also a cognitive propositional action memory problem where they don't recall how to do things that worked. So how do you assess that? Well, the first question you can say is, who did they become like when they were angry with the object of the resource loss? So the detached objective cognitive identity construct. So who did they become like when they were angry with the resource loss experience? And then, so that tells you who, about their identity and how. The next one is how did they manage to invoke such an angry response? In the relating, how did the angry response become invoked in the person experiencing depression? So this is all going back to what the cause and the severity of the experience in conscious experience of depression is. So we're uncovering in that question the proposed cognitive behavioral intention. And this is useful if someone's, for determining severity, because if someone is severely depressed, they may decide to, that really they don't want any behavior whatsoever. And obviously that ultimately means suicide, which is a terrible result because it's not the truth. The truth is that God's creative power is available to them if only they would appropriate that by faith. So that's the hope, you see. Now, the other question you could ask is, what actions caused your raging thoughts? So you have to really go back to the initial event that caused the relational resource loss, you see. And you have to say, what actions caused your raging thoughts? And so this would go to somatic cognitive proposal recollection. So they're going to recall the cognitive proposals which they began to hone in their neural pathways with neuroplastic availability or incapacity to recognize the creative energy of God in these undoubtedly difficult. So I'm not saying the relational resource loss is not suffering. Of course it is. It creates distress, but it's a question of how we handle that and what we do to help ourselves with it. And then the final question you might ask in assessing this is, why did they choose to make you so angry with them in this relational resource loss experience? Why did they choose to make you so angry with them? So, in what sense was there relational choices involved that make us feel angry with someone because we have suffered this resource loss, which is making us so angry, and then when we repress that, we get depressed. So this goes to motivational cognition attachment objection. So what is the objection to the motivational cognition attachment loss? And then finally, in transformational prayer or theophostic prayer, you go through a whole process of recognizing the thoughts, the feelings, and the cognitions in this kind of theory, and you end up with a shared relational learning experience with the person who experiences either yourself or someone else who's experiencing depression, and having a shared understanding of what caused the problems, how you might handle it in terms of hope promotion. And that is my understanding in summary of depression. I hope that it helps you. So methylation and serotonin are the traditional approaches in old-fashioned psychiatry, but in psychology the formulation is more about the various causes of depression and how we might handle that in order to produce the hope necessary to provide the energy that we can begin to resume our lives. Thank you. I hope that's helpful. Until next time.